The officer's hands were shaking. He had seen death before, had buried friends, had watched men die screaming on battlefields across Missouri. None of that had prepared him for what he was holding now, the reins of Bill Anderson's saddle. They looked ordinary at first glance, leather straps worn smooth by use, darkened by sweat and weather and time. The kind of reins you would find on any cavalry saddle in the war. But these reins were not ordinary. Woven into the leather, braided so tightly they had become part of the strap itself, were strands of human hair. The officer began to count. Let us start at the end. October 27, 1864, a road near Albany, Missouri. Bill Anderson and his guerrillas riding into an ambush they did not expect. 300 Union soldiers hidden along the roadside, waiting, patient. They had learned from Centralia, had learned that small forces pursuing Bill Anderson died, had learned that the only way to kill Bloody Bill was overwhelming force and complete surprise. They achieved both. Bill Anderson took 4 bullets and fell from his horse. The most feared guerrilla in Missouri died in a field. Just like the hundreds he had killed before him, his men scattered, some escaped, some were hunted down in the following hours. But the battle was over quickly. What remained was the aftermath. The soldiers approached Bill's body carefully. Even dead, he terrified them. Stories about Bloody Bill had spread through every Union garrison in Missouri. Stories about what he did to prisoners, what he did to the dead, what he carried with him. They had heard about the saddle, now they would see it for themselves. Bill Anderson's horse stood nearby, reins trailing in the dust. A sergeant approached carefully, speaking softly to calm the animal. The horse had carried Bill through dozens of engagements, had heard gunfire and screaming and death. It did not startle easily. The sergeant took the reins and stopped. Something was wrong with them, something about the texture, the way they felt in his hands. He looked closer. Then he dropped them and stepped back. Lieutenant Samuel Cox was the officer who made the official examination. He was a practical man, a lawyer before the war, someone trained to observe details, to catalog evidence, to remain detached from emotional reactions. He would need all of that training now. Cox picked up the reins that the sergeant had dropped, held them up to the afternoon light, examined them with the clinical eye of a man preparing a legal case. The leather was standard military issue, nothing unusual there. But woven into the leather, braided so skillfully that they had become part of the strap itself, were strands of hair, human hair. Cox began to separate the strands, to identify them, to count them. This is what he found. Blonde hair, several shades of it, pale yellow like wheat in summer, darker gold like autumn leaves, the blonde of children and the blonde of adults. Cox counted 7 distinct shades of blonde, 7 people, at minimum. Brown hair, the most common color, ranging from light brown that was almost blonde to dark brown that was almost black, some straight, some wavy, some coarse, and some fine. Cox counted 12 distinct variations of brown, 12 more people, black hair, jet black and blue black and the black that comes with age, some thick and wiry, some thin and straight. Hair from different races, different backgrounds, different lives. Cox counted 9 distinct types of black hair, 9 more souls. Red hair, copper and rust, and the deep auburn that looks brown in some lights. The rarest color, but Bill Anderson had found enough of it. Cox counted 4 distinct shades of red, 4 more victims. Gray hair, the silver of age and the gray of premature stress. Some pure white, some salt and pepper mixed. The hair of people who had lived long enough to see their color fade. Cox counted 8 distinct variations of gray. 8 more lives ended. And then there were the others. Hair that did not fit neatly into categories, mixed colors, unusual textures. Hair that might have been beautiful once, before it was cut from a corpse and woven into a murderer's reins. Cox counted 13 more distinct types, 13 more people reduced to decoration. The total made Cox sit down heavily on a nearby log. 53. 53 distinct individuals whose hair had been woven into Bill Anderson's saddle reins. 53 people who had been killed and scalped and turned into trophies. 53 human beings reduced to the texture beneath a killer's hands. Let us understand what this means. Bill Anderson rode into battle holding the remains of 53 people. Every day, every engagement, every charge and every retreat, and every quiet moment between, he felt them against his palms, felt the different textures of their hair as he guided his horse, made them part of the most intimate connection between rider and mount. This was not accidental, this was not careless, this was deliberate, this was ritual, this was something Bill Anderson chose to do, again and again, 53 times at least. The question that haunted Lieutenant Cox was simple. Why? Why would a man do this? Why would anyone take the time and effort to collect scalps, to braid them into reins, to touch them every single day? The answer was more complicated than Cox could have imagined. Let us go back. Not to the beginning of Bill Anderson's killing, but to the beginning of his pain. The summer of 1863, Kansas City, Missouri, a building used as a prison for Confederate sympathizers and their families. Bill Anderson's sisters were inside. The Union had begun arresting the families of known guerrillas. The logic was simple. If they could not catch the guerrillas themselves, they would punish their families, would hold wives and sisters and mothers hostage, would use them as leverage to force surrender. Bill Anderson's family was targeted. His sisters, Mary and Josephine, were arrested and taken to Kansas City. They had committed no crime themselves. Their only offense was being related to Bill. They were held in a 3-story building on Grand Avenue, a building that was already showing signs of structural damage, a building that Union authorities knew was unsafe. They held the women there anyway. August 13, 1863. The building collapsed. It happened without warning. The walls gave way. The floors fell through each other. 3 stories of brick and timber came down on the women trapped inside. 4 women died immediately. Others were trapped in the rubble. Some screamed for hours before they were pulled out. Josephine Anderson died in the collapse. Mary Anderson survived, but her legs were crushed. She would never walk properly again. Bill Anderson learned about the collapse the next day. He learned that his 14-year-old sister was dead, learned that the Union had imprisoned her in a building they knew was unsafe, learned that she had screamed as the walls came down. Something broke inside Bill Anderson that day, or perhaps something was released. The scalping began shortly after. Before the building collapse, Bill Anderson was a guerrilla, a Confederate irregular who raided Union positions, stole supplies, killed soldiers when necessary. Violent, yes, but not uniquely so. After the building collapse, Bill Anderson became something else. Bloody Bill. The man who did not just kill his enemies but collected them, who took trophies from every engagement, who turned murder into ritual and death into decoration. Let us be clear about what scalping meant in the Civil War. It was not common, it was not accepted, it was considered barbaric, even by the brutal standards of guerrilla warfare, but it happened. Both sides did it. Union soldiers scalped Confederate dead. Confederate guerrillas scalped Union soldiers. The practice was rare enough to be shocking, but common enough to be documented. Bill Anderson took it further than anyone else. He did not just scalp his enemies. He kept the scalps, prepared them, braided them into his equipment, made them part of his daily life. This was not war. This was something darker. The first scalp was taken in September 1863, 1 month after Josephine died. The victim was a Union soldier captured in a skirmish near Rocheport, Missouri. Bill's guerrillas had ambushed a small patrol, killing most and capturing a few. The prisoners were interrogated. Then they were killed. Bill Anderson killed this one himself. And when the man was dead, Bill did something he had never done before. The other guerrillas watched in silence. They had seen death, had caused death, but this was different. Bill Anderson knelt beside the corpse, drew his knife, made careful cuts around the hairline. Then he pulled. The scalp came away with a sound that the witnesses would never forget. A wet tearing, a separation of skin from skull. Bill held up his trophy, looked at it, examined the hair. Brown, ordinary brown, the hair of a man who would never go home. Bill tucked the scalp into his saddlebag. He would add it to his reins later. Why did he do it? The other guerrillas asked each other this question quietly when Bill was not around. They did not understand what they had witnessed. Some thought he had gone mad. That grief for his sister had broken his mind. Some thought it was revenge, a way to punish the Union for what they had done to his family. Some thought it was practical, that the scalps were trophies meant to intimidate, to spread fear, to make the enemy hesitate. None of them were entirely right. None of them were entirely wrong. Bill Anderson never explained himself. He never gave speeches about his motivations, never wrote letters describing his philosophy, never offered justifications for what he did. He simply did it, again and again, scalp after scalp, until the reins of his saddle became heavy with the hair of the dead. Let us count the time. From September 1863 to October 1864. 13 months, 53 scalps that we know of. That is roughly 1 scalp per week. Every week for over a year, Bill Anderson killed someone and took their hair. Some weeks he took more than one, some weeks none. But the average holds. 1 person per week transformed from a human being into a strand in Bill Anderson's reins. Who were the 53? This is the question that haunted Lieutenant Cox, that haunts historians today, that haunts anyone who tries to understand what Bill Anderson was. We know some of them. Soldiers, certainly. Union cavalry and infantry captured in ambushes, men who had surrendered expecting to be treated as prisoners of war, men who learned too late that Bill Anderson did not take prisoners. Some of these men have names in the historical record. Some were reported missing after specific engagements. Some have gravestones somewhere that note they were killed by guerrillas. Most are anonymous, numbers in casualty reports, men who disappeared into the Missouri wilderness and never came home. Not just soldiers. Bill Anderson scalped civilians too. Union sympathizers, people who had informed on guerrilla movements, people who had refused to help his men, people who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a farmer who would not share his food, a shopkeeper who had sold supplies to the Union, a preacher who had prayed for federal victory. Any of these might be among the 53. The different hair colors tell us something. 7 shades of blonde. Some of that blonde was the pale yellow of children. Bill Anderson scalped children. This is not speculation. It is documented in survivor accounts, in the reports of burial details, in the testimony of witnesses who saw what he did. Not many children, but some. Enough that their hair appears in the count. The gray hair tells us something too. 8 variations of gray, the hair of elderly people. People who had lived long lives before Bill Anderson ended them. Old men, old women perhaps. People who posed no military threat. People who were killed for reasons that had nothing to do with warfare. Lieutenant Cox tried to identify some of the victims. He compared the hair colors to reports of missing persons, to descriptions of massacre victims, to the testimony of survivors who had watched Bill Anderson kill. He identified perhaps a dozen, a corporal from the 3rd Missouri Cavalry who disappeared in November 1863, a farmer from Boone County who was found scalped in December, a young woman from Centralia who was killed in the September raid. The rest remained anonymous. 53 people, perhaps a dozen names, 40 more who would never be identified. The braiding was meticulous. This detail struck Cox as particularly disturbing. Bill Anderson had not simply attached scalps to his reins. He had prepared them, dried them, selected individual strands of hair, woven them into the leather with skill and patience. This was craftsmanship. The same hands that killed 53 people had then sat down, probably at night, probably in camp, and carefully braided their remains into functional equipment. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How long did each braiding take? Cox tried to estimate, based on the complexity of the weave, based on how tightly the hair was integrated into the leather. Hours. Each edition would have taken hours of patient work. Bill Anderson sitting by firelight, working hair from a fresh corpse into his reins, taking breaks to eat, to sleep, to plan the next raid, then returning to his work. 53 times, at least. Jesse James saw the Reins many times. He rode with Bill Anderson for months, was with him at Centralia, participated in raids and ambushes and massacres across Missouri. He watched Bill braid new additions into the Reins. Years later, when Jesse was the most famous outlaw in America, interviewers would sometimes ask about Bill Anderson, about what he was like, about the stories of the scalps. Jesse never answered directly. he would change the subject, or give a vague non-answer that satisfied no one, or simply refuse to discuss it. But once, in an unguarded moment, he said something revealing. Bill was the only man I ever met who was not afraid of death, not his own, not anyone else's. He had gone somewhere in his head that the rest of us could not follow. Jesse did not elaborate, but the implication was clear. Even among killers, Bill Anderson was different. Even among men who had done terrible things, he stood apart. The Reins were proof of that difference. Let us talk about the psychology. What creates a man who braids human hair into his equipment? What breaks inside a person to make this seem reasonable? What process transforms grief into this kind of sustained ritualistic violence? Modern psychology has frameworks for understanding this, terms like dehumanization, compartmentalization, trauma response, sadistic personality disorder. None of them quite capture Bill Anderson. The death of Josephine changed everything. This much is clear from the historical record. Before her death, Bill Anderson was violent, but not uniquely so. After her death, he became Bloody Bill. But why scalping? Why this particular expression of grief and rage? Consider what the scalps represented. Proof of death. Tangible evidence that an enemy had been killed. Something Bill could hold, could count, could show to others. But more than that. The scalps were intimate. They came from the most visible part of a person. The part that family and friends would recognize. The part that held a person's individual identity. By taking scalps, Bill was taking identity, stripping his victims of what made them recognizable, reducing unique human beings to anonymous trophies. This was not just murder, this was erasure. And then he kept them close. This is the detail that makes psychologists pause. Bill did not hang scalps from his belt, as some warriors did not display them on his saddle horn for all to see, did not use them purely for intimidation. He wove them into his reins, into the part of his equipment that he touched constantly, into the interface between his hands and his horse. He wanted to feel them, every day, every ride, every moment in the saddle. What does it mean to want that contact? Perhaps it was power, the constant reminder that he had ended these lives, that these people had been reduced to texture beneath his palms. Perhaps it was comfort. Strange as that sounds, the physical presence of his revenge, always with him, never forgotten. Perhaps it was compulsion, something he needed to do and could not explain. A ritual that had become as necessary as eating or sleeping. Perhaps it was all of these. Bill Anderson carried a photograph of Josephine. This detail appears in multiple accounts. A small photograph kept in his pocket, taken out frequently. He would look at it before battles, would hold it while planning raids. The photograph and the reins, his dead sister and his dead enemies. Grief and revenge always together. The wound and the response. The loss that started everything and the trophies that proved his vengeance. Did it help? This is the question that matters most. Did the killing ease Bill's pain? Did each scalp bring him closer to peace? Did the reins weighted with human hair make the loss of Josephine more bearable? The evidence suggests otherwise. Bill Anderson became more violent over time, not less. The killing accelerated. The cruelty intensified. Each scalp seemed to feed the hunger rather than satisfy it. He was chasing something he could never catch. Revenge that could never be complete. Justice that murder could not deliver. The 53 scalps proved he had tried. They also proved he had failed. Frank James offered a different perspective. He also rode with Anderson, also saw the reins up close, also watched the braiding ritual by firelight. Bill was keeping score, Frank said in one interview. Every scalp was a mark against the Union, a debt collected. He wanted to show them what their war had cost. This interpretation makes Bill's behavior more rational, more like warfare and less like madness. But Frank added something else. I never saw Bill smile except when he was killing. Never saw him laugh except after a scalp. He had found something that made him happy. It just was not the kind of happiness anyone else could understand. The other guerrillas had mixed reactions. Some admired it, saw the scalps as proof of Bill's dedication, his commitment to vengeance, his willingness to go further than anyone else. These men sometimes took scalps themselves, not as many, not as systematically, but they followed Bill's example. Others were disturbed. They would fight alongside Bill. would follow his orders in battle, would participate in massacres when ordered, but they would not touch the reins, would not help with the braiding, would not discuss what the reins meant, would treat that aspect of Bill as something private, something not to be examined too closely. One guerrilla, name lost to history, reportedly asked Bill directly, "Why do you keep them?" Bill's answer was brief, "So I do not forget." Do not forget what? Any of them. The guerrilla did not ask follow-up questions on, "So I do not forget." This answer haunts the historical record. On one level, it suggests memorial. Bill keeping the hair so he would remember his enemies, would remember the cost of his revenge, would never let the deaths become abstract. On another level, it suggests obsession, a compulsive need to maintain connection with the dead, an inability to let go even when the killing was done. On a third level, it suggests something almost religious, a ritual of remembrance, a communion with the fallen, a constant acknowledgement of what he had done and why. Bill Anderson was not a reflective man. He did not write diaries or give interviews or explain himself, but 4 words tell us more than pages of analysis could. So I do not forget. Let us talk about the victims, not as numbers in a count, not as colors in a braid, but as people. 53 human beings had lives before they became strands in Bill Anderson's reins, had families, had hopes, had futures that would never arrive. We know almost nothing about most of them, but we can imagine. The blonde hair included a young man from Iowa. We know this because his regiment reported him missing after a skirmish near Glasgow in October 1863. His description matched hair found in the reins, pale blonde, almost white, distinctive enough to be notable. Private James Cornelius, 19 years old. Enlisted because his older brother had enlisted. Sent to Missouri because someone had to be. He wrote letters home about the guerrilla war, about how different it was from what he had expected, about how you never knew where the enemy was until they were killing you. His last letter arrived after he was already dead. His mother kept it until she died 40 years later. She never knew what happened to her son's body, never knew what happened to his hair. The red hair included a woman from Boonville. This is more speculative but supported by evidence. A woman named Margaret Sullivan was killed in a guerrilla raid in January 1864. Witnesses described her hair as bright copper. Her body was found scalped. Margaret was 32 years old, a widow. Her husband had died at Shiloh fighting for the Union. She had spoken publicly against the guerrillas, had called them murderers and cowards. Bill Anderson's men heard about her statements. They came for her specifically. Her hair was distinctive enough that it would have stood out in Bill's collection, bright copper among the browns and blondes and blacks. She became one of the 53 for the crime of speaking her mind. The gray hair included an old farmer named Henderson. This is documented in a report from October 1863. Bill's guerrillas stopped at a farm demanding food. The farmer, a Union sympathizer, refused, said he would rather die than feed traitors. Bill granted his wish. The farmer was 71 years old, had lived in Missouri his entire life, had watched the war tear his community apart, had chosen a side and stuck to it. His gray hair joined the braid that night. The black hair included a young man who may have been enslaved. This detail is murky in the historical record, but some accounts suggest that Bill Anderson killed at least one black man and took his scalp. The man may have been a freed slave working for the Union, may have been a servant traveling with soldiers, may have been simply in the wrong place. We do not know his name. We do not know his story. We know only that his hair became part of the 53, that he died at Bill Anderson's hands, that he was erased as thoroughly as any of the others. These 4 examples represent dozens more. The farmer who hid food, the shopkeeper who informed, the soldier who surrendered, the civilian who ran too slowly. 53 people from different places, different backgrounds, different lives, united only by the manner of their deaths and the destination of their remains. Bill Anderson collected them all, wove them together, touched them every day. Lieutenant Cox spent weeks trying to identify more victims. He compared the hair samples to missing person reports, interviewed survivors of Bill's raids, searched military records for soldiers who had disappeared in guerrilla territory. The work was grim and largely futile. Hair does not carry identification. A strand of brown hair could belong to thousands of men. Without other evidence, matching hair to victim was nearly impossible. Cox identified perhaps 12 with reasonable confidence. The other 41 remained anonymous. Numbers in a count, colors in a braid, lives reduced to texture. The families never received the hair. This might seem obvious, but it bears stating. When a soldier died in battle, his personal effects were typically sent home. Letters, watches, photographs, items that helped families grieve, items that connected the living to the dead. The 53 received no such consideration. Their hair stayed with Bill Anderson until his death. Then it passed to the Union soldiers who captured his equipment. Then it disappeared into history. No family received a lock of hair to remember their loved one. No grave marker noted where the scalps had ended up. The 53 were erased twice, once when Bill took their hair, again when the hair vanished into military bureaucracy. What happened to the Reins? This question occupied historians for decades. After Cox completed his examination, the reins and saddle were taken as war trophies. Some accounts say they were sent to a museum. Others say they were kept by individual soldiers. Others say they were destroyed. The truth is that we do not know. Bill Anderson's saddle has never been definitively located. The reins with their grim cargo have never been found. If they survive, they are in private hands or unlabeled in some collection. The 53 may still exist. Somewhere. Unnamed. Uncounted since Cox made his examination. Waiting to be found. Some claim to have seen the saddle. In the decades after the war, stories circulated about people who had encountered Bill Anderson's equipment. Museum curators, private collectors, curiosity seekers who paid to view relics of the guerrilla war. Most of these stories are impossible to verify, but they share common elements. The viewers describe horror at the braided hair, describe counting colors without meaning to, describe nightmares that lasted for weeks after seeing. The saddle, wherever it is, carries its curse with it. Cox himself never recovered. He left the military after the war, returned to law practice, tried to resume a normal life, but he could not sleep properly, would wake in the night counting colors, would see blonde and brown and black whenever he closed his eyes. He told his family that he had seen the worst of humanity in those reins. That 53 people had been reduced to decoration by a single man's grief and rage, that he could not understand how anyone could do such a thing. And yet, Bill Anderson had been a person too, had been a brother grieving his sister, had been a man driven beyond sanity by loss. The reins were not just evidence of evil, they were evidence of what war could create, what grief could become, what ordinary humans were capable of when pushed far enough. Cox found this more disturbing than the hair itself. The irony was not lost on anyone. When Bill Anderson died, Union soldiers did to his body what he had done to others. They stripped him, displayed him, cut pieces from him as souvenirs. A soldier took his trigger finger. Another took a lock of his hair. Others cut buttons and cloth from his clothing. Bill Anderson, who had collected 53 scalps, was himself collected after death. The cycle continued. His body was displayed in Richmond, Missouri for 3 days. People came from miles around to see, to spit, to curse, to stab at the corpse with whatever implements they had brought. Women came with knitting needles. Men came with pocket knives. Children came because their parents wanted them to see what happened to monsters. The body was barely recognizable by the time it was buried. Bill Anderson, who had shown no mercy to his victims, received none in return. Let us consider what the 53 represent. Not just lives lost, not just crimes committed, but something larger about human nature, about war, about what grief can become when channeled through violence. Bill Anderson was not born a monster. He was made into one, by war, by loss, by the death of a 14-year-old girl in a collapsing building. This does not excuse what he did, does not justify the 53 scalps, does not make the horror any less horrific, but it does complicate the story. Every war creates men like Bill Anderson, men who lose something precious and never recover, men who find that killing fills a void that nothing else can touch, men who transform their pain into systematic destruction. The Civil War created thousands of them. Most killed and were forgotten. Most left no record beyond casualty counts and burial reports. Most were anonymous in their violence. Bill Anderson was remembered because he left evidence. 53 strands of evidence braided into leather. What separates Bill Anderson from other killers? Not the killing itself. Plenty of men killed more than 53 people during the Civil War. Artillery officers who ordered bombardments, generals who sent regiments into slaughter, ordinary soldiers who shot and stabbed through battle after battle. What separates Bill is the personal nature of his killing. Each scalp was individual. Each one required close contact. Each one was taken deliberately, with time and attention, and each one was kept. Bill Anderson did not kill abstractly. He killed specifically, and he remembered. The braiding is key to understanding him. Consider what the act of braiding requires: patience, skill, time, attention to detail. Bill Anderson sat by firelight, night after night, weaving dead people into his equipment. This was not the act of a berserker, not the act of someone lost in rage. This was deliberate, methodical, considered. Whatever madness drove Bill, it was not the chaotic kind. It was organized, planned, sustained over months and years. That makes it more disturbing, not less. Some historians have called it ritual: the scalping, the preparation, the braiding, the daily contact through the reins, a ritual of death and remembrance, a ceremony performed over and over, a religious practice with murder at its center. If this interpretation is correct, then the 53 were not just victims. They were sacrifices, offerings to something Bill Anderson worshipped, to vengeance, to grief, to the memory of Josephine. He killed for her, scalped for her, braided for her. Every strand of hair was a prayer written in death. Let us return to the photograph. Bill kept a picture of Josephine with him always, would take it out before battles, would hold it while the killing was planned. He would look at her face, at the sister who had died in a Union prison, at the 14-year-old crushed by a collapsing building. Then he would ride out with reins made of the dead, the photograph and the hair, the love and the hate, the grief and the vengeance, inseparable, intertwined, braided together like the scalps themselves. Could Bill Anderson have been stopped? Not by force. He was killed by force eventually. 300 soldiers in ambush ended his war. But could he have been stopped before? Could someone have reached the man beneath the monster? Could grief have been channeled differently? We will never know. By the time anyone tried to understand Bill Anderson, he was already beyond understanding, already committed to his path, already holding 53 lives in his hands. The Union soldiers who examined the reins reported nightmares, not just cocks, others as well, men who had seen combat, who had killed, who thought themselves hardened to death. The reins broke something in them, because the reins were not just evidence of killing, they were evidence of collecting, of keeping, of cherishing. Bill Anderson had loved these scalps in some terrible way, had spent hours with them, had made them part of his daily life. That love was more disturbing than the death. What did the 53 have in common, aside from being dead, aside from being scalped, aside from ending up in Bill Anderson's collection? Some were soldiers, some were civilians, some were young, some were old, some were men, some may have been women. The only common thread was Bill Anderson himself. He chose them, he killed them, he kept them. They became his in a way that no other relationship could match, more intimate than family, more permanent than friendship, a bond that lasted beyond death. Bill Anderson owned the 53, possessed them completely, touched them every day until his own death ended the connection. This is not a love story, but it is a story about possession, about the desire to hold on to something, about the lengths a person will go to feel connected. Bill lost Josephine. He would never stop losing her. The 53 were his attempt to hold on, to collect lives since he could not preserve the one that mattered, to touch the dead since he could not touch his sister. It was twisted, it was wrong, it was inhuman, but it was also, in some terrible way, human. Lieutenant Cox wrote in his private journal, "This passage was discovered decades later. I counted 53 distinct persons in those reins. 53 lives ended and collected and braided into leather. And I thought about what could make a man do this. I thought about losing my own sister, about how that would feel, about what I might become if someone killed her and faced no justice. I would like to believe I would remain civilized, would seek legal remedy, would maintain my humanity, but I am not certain. And that uncertainty is what haunts me most. Cox was asking a question we all must face. What are we capable of? We tell ourselves we would never do what Bill Anderson did, would never scalp, would never collect, would never braid human hair into our equipment. But we have never lost what Bill lost. Have never watched our family destroyed by an uncaring authority. Have never felt the specific grief of a 14-year-old sister crushed in a prison collapse. We do not know what we would become. This is not to excuse Bill Anderson. The 53 deserved to live, deserved to die in bed surrounded by family, deserved to keep their hair attached to their heads. Bill took all of that from them, made them into objects, erased their humanity. No amount of grief justifies that. No loss is great enough to permit that response. Bill Anderson was a murderer and a monster, but he was also a brother who lost his sister, a man who watched his family destroyed, a human being pushed past the point of sanity. Both things are true, both things matter. The 53 deserve to be remembered, not as colors in a count, not as textures in a braid, but as people. James Cornelius from Iowa, Margaret Sullivan from Boonville, the old farmer Henderson, the unnamed black man, the blonde children whose hair was pale as wheat. They had names, they had stories, they had people who loved them. Bill Anderson tried to erase all of that, tried to reduce them to trophies, tried to make them nothing more than the feel of hair against his palms. We should refuse that erasure, should remember that each strand was a life, each color was a person, each texture was a story that deserved a better ending. How do we remember 53 people we cannot name? This is the challenge of history. We have Bill Anderson's name, his biography, his photograph, his legend. We have almost nothing about his victims, just hair colors, just numbers, just the fact that they existed and then did not. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps simply acknowledging the 53 is a form of remembrance. Perhaps refusing to let them be forgotten is a form of resistance against what Bill did. He tried to erase them. We can choose not to let him succeed. The Reins tell one more story. They tell us that violence has consequences beyond the immediate act, that killing echoes forward in time, that the dead continue to haunt even after they are gone. Bill Anderson thought he was punishing the Union, thought he was avenging Josephine, thought he was winning something with each scalp he took, but the Reins haunted him too. He touched them every day, felt them every moment in the saddle, carried them through every battle and every quiet hour between. He could not escape what he had done. The 53 were always with him, always present, always reminding him of who he had become. Some guerrillas reported that Bill talked to the Reins late at night, when he thought no one was listening. He would hold them and murmur, words too quiet to hear, conversations with the dead. Was he apologizing, gloating, explaining? We will never know. But the image is haunting. Bill Anderson alone by firelight, holding the braided hair of 53 victims, speaking to them in the darkness. A man who could not let go even of the people he had killed. Let us end with the counting. Lieutenant Cox sat on that log in October 1864, the reins in his hands, the afternoon light fading around him. He separated strands, identified colors, made notes: blonde, brown, black, red, gray, others: 7, 12, 9, 4, 8, 13, 53. He set down his pencil, looked at what he had written, understood perhaps for the first time what Bill Anderson truly was: a collector, a keeper of the dead, a man who had transformed his grief into 53 permanent trophies. And Cox understood something else too. He would never stop counting. For the rest of his life, he would see colors and count them, would see hair and wonder where it came from, would look at braided leather and feel sick. Bill Anderson had given him that gift, the knowledge of what humans could become. The sun set over Missouri that October evening. Bill Anderson was dead. His men were scattered. His war was over. But the Reins remained, somewhere, in some collection, in some warehouse, in some grave where they were buried with their dead maker. 53 people braided into leather, 53 stories silenced forever, 53 lives, reduced to the feel of hair against a killer's palms. We remember them. Not their names, which are mostly lost, not their faces, which are completely lost, not their stories, which died with them. But we remember that they existed, that they were human beings before they were trophies, that they had lives before Bill Anderson ended them, that they deserved better than to become decoration on a murderer's saddle. 53. That number is their memorial, the only one they have, the only one we can give them. Bill Anderson screamed his sister's name when he died. Some accounts say this, say that the last word on his lips was Josephine, that even in death she was what mattered most. If this is true, then Bill Anderson died as he had lived, holding on to grief, refusing to let go, carrying the dead with him to the very end, the 53 in his reins, the one in his heart, all the dead, traveling together. This is the story of Bloody Bill's saddle, the story of 53 people reduced to hair colors in a count, the story of grief transformed into collection, the story of war's capacity to create monsters from men. Lieutenant Cox counted the colors. We count them still: blonde, brown, black, red, gray. Others, 53 lives, one terrible memorial. Remember the number. Remember what it means. Remember that each strand was a person. And remember that Bill Anderson, for all his horror, was also a person. A broken one. A destroyed one. A person who should never have become what he became, but a person nonetheless. That is the true horror of the story. Not that a monster collected 53 scalps, but that a man did. The reins are gone. The saddle is gone. Bill Anderson is buried in an unmarked grave, his exact location forgotten. The 53 are scattered, unnamed, unknown, but the story remains. And in the story, they all live on. The killer and the killed, the collector and the collected, bound together forever, braided like hair into leather. 53, count them, remember them, mourn them. That is all we can do now. That is all we owe them. The memory of a number, the knowledge of what it represents. This has been the story of the saddle with human hair. The story of a man who could not let go. The story of 53 people who deserved to be remembered. Remember them. Remember their number. Remember that they were more than colors in a count. They were people. Once. End. Let us speak of the process itself. Scalping was not simple, it was not quick. It required knowledge and practice, and a willingness to engage with the body in ways that most soldiers avoided. Bill Anderson became an expert. The technique was ancient. Native American warriors had practiced it for centuries. European colonists had learned it from them. By the time of the Civil War, the practice had spread across cultures and conflicts, but knowing the history did not make it easier to witness. The scalp begins at the hairline, a cut, usually made with a sharp knife, tracing the edge where hair meets forehead, continuing around the sides, meeting at the back of the skull, then the pulling. The scalp does not want to separate. It is attached by connective tissue, by blood vessels, by the intimate connection between skin and bone. It must be torn away. The sound is distinctive. Survivors who heard Bill Anderson scalp his victims described it the same way. A wet tearing, a separation that sounds almost like fabric ripping, a sound that cannot be unheard. Bill became faster over time. His first scalp took several minutes. He was learning, figuring out where to cut, how hard to pull, what technique worked best. By his 10th scalp, he could do it in under a minute. By his 50th, he was efficient enough that witnesses barely saw him work. A flash of knife, a quick motion, and then he was holding his trophy. Practice makes perfect, even in horror. The preservation required additional work. A fresh scalp is wet, bloody, prone to decay. To keep it, to make it suitable for braiding, Bill had to prepare each one. The preparation involved scraping, removing the flesh from the underside of the skin, cleaning away blood and tissue, leaving only the scalp itself, the hair still attached, then drying. Bill would stretch the scalps on frames, leave them in the sun or by the fire, wait for them to cure into something resembling leather. Only then could he begin the braiding. This process took days. Each scalp required attention over multiple days before it was ready. Bill had to check them, turn them, ensure they were drying properly, while riding, while fighting, while planning raids. He maintained his collection even in the chaos of guerrilla warfare. The other gorillas tried not to watch, but sometimes they could not avoid it. Bill working on a fresh scalp by firelight, his knife scraping flesh, his hands manipulating skin that had belonged to a living person hours before. Some men vomited. Some men pretended not to see. Some men left the gorillas entirely, unable to stomach what their leader had become. One gorilla described the smell. Fresh scalps smell like blood, like meat, like the inside of a body exposed to air. Drying scalps smell worse. The gorilla said that Bill's tent had a particular odor, something between leather and rot, something that clung to the nostrils and would not leave. He could smell Bill coming before he could see him. The smell of 53 deaths carried everywhere. Let us speak of the specific victims we know. Not by hair color this time, but by story, by what records survive, by the fragments of lives that can still be reconstructed. Thomas Reynolds was 17 years old. He joined the Union Army in August 1863, arrived in Missouri in September, was assigned to a patrol that would encounter Bill Anderson in October. He lasted 6 weeks in the war. His hair was light brown, almost blonde in certain light. His mother had commented on it in letters, had called him her golden boy. Bill Anderson took that golden hair in October 1863. Thomas Reynolds had no grave. His body was never recovered. His parents learned of his death through a brief official notification that said nothing about what had happened to their son. They mourned a soldier. They never knew he had become a trophy. Elizabeth Crenshaw was 44 years old. She was not a soldier. She was a woman who had spoken too loudly about Union sympathies in a Confederate-leaning town, had criticized the guerrillas, had called for their capture. Bill Anderson heard about her. In December 1863, his men came to her farm. They found her hiding in the root cellar. They brought her to Bill. What happened next was witnessed by a neighbor who hid and watched. Elizabeth Crenshaw died begging for her children. Her hair was dark brown, streaked with early gray, 44 years old, and she had already begun to gray from the stress of war. Bill took her scalp himself, added it to his collection. Her children were orphaned. They never learned what happened to their mother's remains. Samuel Bright was a freedman. This detail is important. He had been enslaved, had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, had chosen to stay in Missouri rather than flee north. He worked for a Union supply depot, loading wagons, moving equipment, doing the labor that kept armies functioning. In February 1864, Bill Anderson's guerrillas raided the depot. Samuel Bright was captured along with several soldiers. The soldiers were killed quickly. Samuel Bright was killed slowly. His hair was thick and black, curly in a way that made it distinctive in Bill's collection, a texture that stood out among the others. He had been free for less than a year when he died. James O'Brien was 63 years old, an Irish immigrant who had come to America in 1820, had lived in Missouri for 40 years, had built a farm, raised children, watched grandchildren born. He had opinions about the war, opinions he shared too freely, opinions that marked him as an enemy to guerrillas passing through. Bill Anderson stopped at his farm in March 1864. O'Brien refused to give them food, refused to give them shelter, cursed them in a mixture of English and Gaelic that made his feelings clear. Bill admired the courage, said so to his men. Then he killed the old man anyway. O'Brien's hair was pure white, the white of age, of survival, of 63 years of living that ended at Bill Anderson's hands. His grandchildren found his body the next morning, found his scalped head, found evidence of what their grandfather had suffered. They carried that memory for the rest of their lives. These 4 represent 49 more, each with a story, each with a family, each with a life that deserved to continue. Bill Anderson ended all of them, collected all of them, braided all of them into his equipment. The mathematics of horror bear repeating. 53 scalps over 13 months, average of 1 per week. But the distribution was not even. Some weeks Bill took no scalps, some weeks he took several. The Centralia massacre alone may have contributed a dozen to his collection. The rate accelerated toward the end. In his final months, Bill was killing and scalping more frequently. The collection was growing faster. The reins were becoming heavier with each edition. Why the acceleration? Perhaps tolerance. The psychological defense mechanisms that allow people to do terrible things require escalation to maintain their effectiveness. Bill needed more death to feel the same satisfaction, perhaps opportunity. As his reputation grew, more people were captured, more enemies identified, more chances to add to the collection presented themselves. Perhaps desperation. Bill knew he could not survive forever, knew the Union was closing in, wanted to complete whatever goal he had set for himself before time ran out. We cannot know for certain. We know only that the killing increased. Let us speak of what survivors witnessed, not the scalping itself, but the aftermath. The way Bill interacted with his growing collection, the rituals he developed around it. Bill would examine his reins every morning. This is documented in multiple accounts. Before riding, before planning, before doing anything else, Bill would take out the reins and look at them, running his fingers along the braids, feeling the different textures, counting perhaps, though no one knew what he was counting. The ritual took several minutes. Then, and only then, would he begin his day. New additions were cause for ceremony. When Bill braided a fresh scalp into the reins, he did not do it casually. He did it deliberately, almost reverently. Witnesses described a kind of solemnity. Bill holding the new hair, examining it, perhaps saying something, though the words were never heard clearly. Then the careful braiding, the integration of new death into existing death, the reins growing heavier with each addition. Bill showed the reins to special prisoners. Not all prisoners, not routinely. But sometimes, when he wanted to make a particular impression, he would show them, would explain what they were looking at, would tell them how many different people were represented, would watch their faces as understanding dawned. Then he would kill them and add their hair to the collection. The showing was part of the horror, making victims understand what they would become before they became it. The effect on survivors was profound. Men who saw the reins and lived to tell about it were never the same. One survivor, a Union soldier released in a prisoner exchange, wrote about it years later. He showed me the reins, told me to count the colors. I counted until I could not count anymore. Then he smiled and said there were more than I had found. I still see those colors when I close my eyes, still feel the texture against my fingers when he made me touch them. I'm an old man now. 50 years have passed and still I cannot forget. The reins were a weapon, not in the physical sense, but psychologically, emotionally. They were designed to terrorize, to demonstrate what Bill Anderson was capable of, and they worked. Stories of the reins spread through Union forces. Soldiers knew about them before they ever encountered Bill, knew what waited for them if they were captured. Some soldiers refused to patrol in areas where Bill was known to operate. Some deserted rather than face him. The 53 scalps killed even people Bill never met, killed their courage, killed their willingness to fight. This was part of guerrilla warfare, the psychological dimension, the manipulation of fear, the understanding that terror could be as effective as bullets. Bill Anderson understood this instinctively. The reins were not just trophies, they were propaganda. They were proof of what he would do. They were a message written in human hair. The message was simple. I am not like other enemies. I am something worse. Fear me. The Union eventually learned to use this fear against him. The ambush that killed Bill Anderson was motivated partly by revenge for what he had done, by the stories of the Reins, by the knowledge of the 53. Soldiers volunteered for the ambush specifically because they wanted to end Bill Anderson, wanted to stop the collecting, wanted to avenge the nameless dead whose hair he carried. 300 volunteers, waiting in the woods, for the man with the reins. Let us speak of legacy. Bill Anderson died in October 1864. The war ended 6 months later. The guerrilla conflict faded into history, but the story of the Reins did not fade. For decades after the war, people asked about the scalps. Museum curators, historians, curiosity seekers, people who had heard the stories and wanted to know if they were true. The answers were always unsatisfying. Yes, the scalps existed. Yes, Lieutenant Cox counted 53. Yes, they were braided into the reins. But where were they now? Where had they gone? Could they be found? No one knew. Several people claimed to have the reins. In the decades after the war, multiple individuals came forward claiming to possess Bill Anderson's saddle, claiming the Reins were intact, claiming the 53 still existed. Most of these claims were false. Examined closely, the saddles were wrong. The reins were simple leather. The scalps were absent or obviously fake. But the claims continued. People wanted to believe they could find the Reins, wanted to touch what Bill Anderson had touched, wanted to count the colors for themselves. The morbid fascination never died. Some claims may have been genuine. One collector in the 1920s showed historians a set of Reins that seemed authentic. The braiding matched descriptions. The hair appeared real, but the Reins disappeared before proper examination could be conducted. Stolen, perhaps, hidden, destroyed, or simply lost to time. The 53 may still exist somewhere, maybe sitting in an attic or a museum storage room, maybe waiting to be rediscovered, or they may be gone forever. What would it mean to find them now? If the Reins were discovered today, what would we do with them? Display them in a museum? Let people count the colors as Cox once did? Destroy them? Remove the physical evidence of Bill Anderson's horror? Return them to the earth? Bury the remains of 53 people who were never properly buried? There is no good answer. Perhaps it is better that they are lost. The 53 deserve rest, deserve to stop being counted, deserve to stop being examined, deserve to stop being evidence. Their hair, wherever it is, should be allowed to decay in peace. Their memory should be their only memorial.